Okay, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to look a little bit more in depth of the synovial joints. Synovial joints are the joints that have a joint cavity. The walls of this cavity are formed by what is called the articular capsule, which is just a structure that is attached to each bone just outside the area of the bone's articulating surface. So just outside the area of the bone that is going to move around. So the friction that's going to occur between the bones at the synovial joint is going to be prevented by the presence of a few things. The first is the articular cartilage, which is a thin layer of hyaline cartilage that covers the entire portion or the entire surface that is moving, the articulating surface. And, those covers act like Teflon covers and just allow each bone to be able to smoothly glide against each other. The other thing that reduces friction is the stuff that lines the inner surface of the articular capsule, which is called the synovial membrane, which we've heard before, secretes synovial fluid, which synovia means thick, basically, and so it just is a thick, slimy fluid that also reduces friction and nourishes the cartilage because there's no blood vessels in there. Synovial joints allow for free movement, like we said before. They are the most common, and we call the joints that allow for free movement diarthroses. Okay, so we've all heard that before. Let's get into them in a little bit more depth. First, let's talk about ligaments that are involved. Outside of the articulating surfaces, the bones are going to be connected by ligaments, which are just strong bands of fibrous connective tissue. These strengthen and support the joint by anchoring the bones together and preventing their separation. Those ligaments allow for normal movements at a joint, but also sometimes limit the range of those motions. And so which is pretty good because it'll prevent excessive or abnormal joint movements. Ligaments are classified based on their relationship to that articular capsule we just talked about. So an extrinsic ligament is located on the outside of the articular capsule. An intrinsic ligament is fused to or incorporated directly into the wall of that articular capsule. And then an intracapsular ligament is located inside of the articular capsule. At many of these synovial joints, we'll have additional support that's provided by muscles and the tendons that act across the joint. A tendon is a dense connective tissue structure that attaches a muscle to a bone. As forces that act upon a joint increase, the body will automatically increase the overall strength of contraction of those muscles that are crossing the joint. That allows the muscle and its tendon to serve as what they call a dynamic ligament. It just resists forces and supports the joint. That type of indirect support by muscles is really important, for example, at the shoulder joint, because those ligaments are relatively weak, but the muscles and that indirect support of that dynamic ligament supports it. So let's talk about some additional structures that are involved here. A few synovial joints in the body have a fibrocartilage structure located between the articulating bones. There's two types. The first is an articular disc, which is generally small and oval shaped. You'll find one at the sternoclavicular joint or between the distal ends of the radius and the ulna. And the other is a meniscus, which is larger and C-shaped, and that provides for shock absorption in the knee. That's one example. And then there are things called bursae. A bursa, which is the individual form, is a thin connective tissue sac filled with lubricating liquid. They're located where skin, ligaments, muscles, or muscle tendons can rub against each other. Bursae reduce friction by separating the adjacent structures, preventing them from rubbing directly against each other. A subcutaneous bursa is located between the skin and an underlying bone. It allows the skin to move smoothly over the bone. You'll find those in your elbows and your knees. A submuscular bursa is found between a muscle and an underlying bone, or between adjacent muscles. These prevent rubbing of the muscle during movements. You'll find one at the hip. And a subtendinous bursa is found between a tendon and a bone. You'll find those in your shoulder, protecting the tendon that passes under the scapula. And then the last thing is a tendon sheath. It's similar in structure to a bursa, but it's smaller. It's a connective tissue sac that surrounds a muscle tendon and places where the tendon will cross a joint. It contains a lubricating fluid that allows for smooth motions of the tendon during muscle contraction and joint movements. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about here are the different types of these synovial joints that we'll find. So the first one is up here, a pivot joint. A pivot joint is a rounded portion of a bone that's enclosed within a ring formed partially by the articulation with another bone and partially by a ligament. And so these are just kind of like examples of sort of how they work and what they look like. The bone rotates within this ring. Since the rotation is around a single axis, pivot joints are functionally classified as uniaxial diarthroses, which once again just means that it can move freely but it only moves on one axis here. So it's really like, just as you see, like it can pivot in this circular motion. You're familiar with this kind of joint if you move your forearms or you turn your head side to side. Those are pivot joints. The next one is a hinge joint right here. The hinge joint, you'll have the convex end, which is right here, convex end of this bone, articulating with the concave end of the adjoining bone. That type of joint allows only for bending and straightening motions along a single axis. And so hinge joints are functionally classified as uniaxial joints. A really good example of this is your elbow. You can bring your forearm up to your bicep and you can bring it back down so it can bend and it can straighten. The next that I want to talk about is the condyloid joint that's over here. A condyloid joint, that some people will also call an ellipsoid joint, happens when you get the shallow depression at the end of one bone articulating with the rounded structure from an adjacent bone. So if you think about the knuckle joints, those are a good example. Functionally, condyloid joints are biaxial joints, which means they allow for movement in two planes. So if you think about your knuckles, one movement involves the bending and straightening of your fingers, and the second movement is this side-to-side movement, which allows to spread your fingers apart and bring them back together. All right. The next one I want to talk about is the saddle joint. If you look, it actually looks like somebody may be riding in a horse saddle. Both of the articulating surfaces for the bones have a saddle shape, and they just fit right into each other. That saddle shape is concave in one direction and convex in the other. Saddle joints are functionally classified as biaxial joints. That means that they can move in two different axes. This joint provides the thumb the ability to move away from the palm of the hand along two planes, right? So you can move your thumb within the same plane as the palm of the hand, and it can also jut out away perpendicular to the palm. So you can test that out right now. You can move your thumb in two different axes. This movement of that first carpometacarpal joint is what gives us our distinctive opposable thumbs. Okay, next one is the plane joint, which is also called a gliding joint. The articulating surfaces here are flat or slightly curved and are approximately the same size. So you can see it's sort of just like they glide against each other. The motion at this type of joint is usually small and tightly constrained by surrounding ligaments. Based on their shape, they are classified as multiaxial, right? You can see here that it says it can move in any direction. But in reality, they're not always going to be able to do that because of the ligaments that are going to constrain movement. One example are the intercarpal joints of the wrist. You really don't get a lot of movement in those joints, but technically they could move in every direction. And then last thing that I want to talk about is the joint with the greatest range of motion, and that's the ball and socket joint. These joints, the rounded head of one bone, which is the ball, fits into the concave articulation of another, which is the socket. The hip joint and the shoulder joint are the only examples of this in the body, and if you think about it, that's where you get the most range of motion, in your hips and in your shoulders. These are also classified functionally as multiaxial because they can move in this direction away and in the front and behind you, to the left and to the right, and also you can rotate them away from the midline. Okay, and so with that, that has gone over all of the synovial joints, which once again are the most common type of joints in the body. I look forward to the next video being posted very soon.